Although I suppose there might be a kind of tactical frivolity.
I do embrace frivolity.
Okay, good. Shall we look at another slide? I don't know
Yes.
what the next slide you have available.
Yes.
Well, here, may I ask a question here? I've always been interested in the recurrence of headless figures in your work.
Yes.
Would you like to talk a little bit about that without explaining it?
That's complex. Well, that actually started as a joke about the French Revolution. I wanted to somehow, of course, I know that, if I were to actually decapitate somebody, I'd go to jail. But through my art, I could actually, have this fictitious aristocratic characters, and then, relieve them of their heads. So that's kind of how that started. But then, I love the Victoria and Albert Museum. I love, Victoriana. And, so that was that period when I was kind of Victoriana obsessed, and I was obsessed with the works of Oscar Wilde, and because I liked the fact that Oscar Wilde was, political, but he did it with kind of style, and he challenged, the aristocracy through his style. And also, obviously, being of Irish origin, and also because of his sexuality, somehow I identified with that sort of outsider, period. And so it was a period in which I was actually looking at, Victorian costumes, and then thinking about, those photographs of English people in India, in the heat, and they would be wearing, Victorian clothes. So, so that's this piece here was actually shown in Sensation, and that was the Saatchi exhibition at the Royal Academy. My first actually encounter with the Royal Academy. So that's How Does a Girl Like You Get to Be a Girl Like You? It was first shown at the Barbican and then at the Royal Academy. Yeah.
The Diary of Victorian Dandy. I mean, here we are. I mean, again, I don't want to ventriloquize you, so don't let me do that.
Yes.
But it's clear that you've chosen the plane of history, and you've chosen to engage Britain in its troubled relationship with its own history, and to playfully, gently, seductively, to introduce a certain presence into historical memory, which has not always been, and I'm being terribly polite here because of where we are, it's not always been at ease with itself with regard to the lingering residues of that global preeminence, which of course now, following the vote to leave the EU, becomes charged with an entirely new significance as we start to have to imagine a different kind of future,
yes.
Post-colonial future,
yes.
And one in which, it seems to me, artists of your generation, and you in particular perhaps, have played a really fundamental role in prompting that conversation, stimulating that conversation. It's not been led by academics, it's not been led by politicians, but it has been led by artists and the institutions and the curators of those institutions. Now, I think that's a remarkable thing, actually, to look at in a historical frame.
Well, we, the colonialism happened. We are here. There's a relationship with the rest of the world. Britain has always had, a strong relationship with the rest of the world, and so we're not going to go away. And we have to deal with that. We have to deal with what kind of society do we have. Is it you can call it what you will in a multicultural society, or we have to get used to living next to each other, and that has it has a history. And I want to explore those, but I also want to do that in the context of history, in the context of art history. I mean, Rake's Progress was Diary of a Victorian Dandy was actually inspired by Hogarth's Rake's Progress. But I did not want to be moralistic in the series, and it's actually my first public artwork. I did that series in, 1805. No, that was a long time. I look young there. I look quite young in that picture.
Yes,
That was a very long time ago. But that series was on the London Underground.
Yes, I remember. Yeah.
Yes. And that had a kind of an impact, on people who saw that.
Indeed.
And, but I was also wanting to do it in a theatrical way. So the theatrical is fundamental to some of my strategies. And so, did that work and just took you through the life of a dandy. But in the context of this sort of, but you see, throughout art school and studying art history, whenever I actually saw a person of African origin, they wouldn't actually be at the front. They would be in the background. There might be a valet or, somebody like that. So actually, the picture that I'd never seen a historical picture like that of an African, so I decided to actually make one. Yeah.
Well, I suppose I want to express my own personal pleasure and gratitude to you then, because so much of my early life, very typical of my generation, I think, a little bit older than you, was dominated by people telling me to go back to my own country. And that was a source of some pain, I must admit.
Yes.
Of not having another country that
Yes,
immediately sprang to mind as an alternative
absolutely.
destination.
Yes.
So I think by forcing that presence into the frame,
yes,
you open up this very troubling area of how one belongs and how one is recognized as belonging.
Yes.
Not just how one is seen, but how one sees oneself being seen in that frame.
Yeah.
And I think that's been a terribly important thing. And I'd like to say that for me was a bridge into your larger concerns with public art and your public art project.
Yes.
Perhaps this is the moment really to talk about the fourth plinth,
yes,
and to talk about Boris Johnson's your commission to do the Victory.
Do we have to bring Boris into this?
Let's move on a little bit. There's so many things to talk about there, but we do have
there is this, yes.
From 2010.
Yes.
I mean, I'm struck by a number of things about this. First of all, the attempt to make the Victory in a bottle.
Yes.
There's something about the change of scale in relation to the monumentality of the militaristic space, the saturated zone of the square itself. There's something about that change of scale, but at the same time, the ship's small. It's almost like a household version of something out there at large in the world. I mean, how much is that tension around scale important to the way you imagined that work? And of course, it's important to and delightful that it's ended up at Greenwich in the World Heritage Site of the National Maritime Museum.
Yes.
A very fitting resting place, if I may say.
Yes. Well, on the question of monumentality, it's quite interesting to do the reverse, so to change the scale of what is essentially a toy, a ship in a bottle. But then, what it represents, I mean, it's a grand thing made playful, but also historically loaded. I mean, when I was invited to do the public art project in Trafalgar Square, I mean, it's obvious. You've got Nelson's column there. I wanted to engage that space. It's historically loaded. A lot of male statues, figures there. But for somebody of African origin, now the Battle of Trafalgar for me actually means colonization, because when Nelson won that battle, Britain had, more access to the seas and was able to actually, expand empire. And if that battle had been lost, I probably would be speaking French to you now. But it turned out that Nelson won that battle. So, but I wanted, you see, the space, it's a very scary space to put work in because, millions of people per hour. And it's, but I decided not to be frightened by this and to actually contain HMS Victory, but to contain it in a magical way. And that's what I then went on to do. But of course, you're not allowed to ask me how the ship got into the bottle.
No. You'd have to kill me, wouldn't you?
I would have to do that,
well,
yes.
I won't ask then. I mean, Nelson became very important to you too, didn't he?
Yes.
And Fanny also, Nelson's jacket, Fanny's dress.
Yes.
I mean, Nelson, I always had a soft spot for him because when Colonel Edward Marcus Despard was on trial, I think Nelson was cured of the ague by an African slave woman who helped him when they were exploring Lake Nicaragua early on. And as a result, he spoke up at the trial of Edward Marcus Despard that this woman, who was widowed at that time, was about to be widowed by the execution of her husband, should be in receipt of his Navy pension. So I've always felt Nelson was a very complex and interesting character. We don't get to see the richness and complexity of that character behind the image of him as a heroic icon.
Yes.
Now that's been a matter of concern to you too, I understand.
Well, I felt that this idea of the Nelson, the heroic Nelson and so on, Nelson was very much human. He was flawed. He had an affair with his mistress. He neglected his wife. I mean, I did go on to make an opera about this. So I wanted to, this is also, that project I did, it's about the making human, seeing the human side of this heroic figure that's been kind of almost elevated to the point of perfection, and so that's kind of why I did that film.
And you used La Traviata.
I used Traviata, yes.
To suggest the tragic character.
Well, particularly his wife and the neglect of his wife, and. Yes, it's very difficult to describe a film
without being able to look at it.
Without being able to.
Sorry.
Yeah.
But I just felt it was important that your connection with Nelson, you've been holding hands with him and Fanny for a little while. And again, it's the same with the cloth, really.
Yes.
It's a question of me in trying to induce you to represent yourself here, to show what you're bringing with you at each stage of this journey. So we have in your back, we have the cloth, we have the Nelsons, we have their clothing.
Yes.
And with that clothing, perhaps a more theatrical approach to the making of identity, the performance of identity.
Yes, I mean, the series I did, I combined, I interrupted the film with a series of the depiction of death in art history. And so the Nelson figure became this sort of a symbolic figure for a sort of a lost glory. But at the same time, I'm never, the figures that I somehow parody, I also admire. So this is the contradiction in my work. A lot of people don't quite understand why. I mean, for example, when I was invited to Buckingham Palace, I loved being there. I thought it was great. But then, people would actually expect something else. But I've always admired tradition, actually. But then I also like to challenge tradition.
Yes.
So I'm in a very strange place.
The cloth is an interesting example because it's an invented tradition, and it becomes a tradition, but it isn't as traditional as it would announce, as it might have been announced.
And also, you see, the complexity of practice is that I can't say that I fully understand my own position. I'm constantly challenged by my own position.
Well, maybe that's to do with your commitment to restaging things, to restaging not just historical relations and events, but art historical relations and events, and in the restaging, perhaps to bend them a little bit, to shape them in different ways, to accent them.
Well, I mean, I think also the issue of carnival, right, in the Caribbean, for example, or in Brazil, or for that matter in Venice. On the day of carnival, you can become somebody else, right? So if you were the slave, on the day of carnival, you can become the master, and the master can become this. So in a way, art for me, it's that space of transformation, of transcendence, so that then it's rather futile to be expecting me for my art to actually express me, because my art doesn't fully express who I am. My art expresses a transformational state, the place I want to get to in my fantasies. So it's, so it's a futile exercise to see that it is an expression of what I think.
I hadn't anticipated or been familiar with the work that's been written about you in relation to a Yoruba tradition, and particularly the figure of the trickster god Eshu.
Yes.
But you're sounding like the trickster god Eshu a little bit this evening, I think.
Well, I mean, I think the job of art is to be ungraspable, and that's what Eshu does. That's what the trickster character is. The moment you think you've got him or her, she's been transformed into something else.
And Eshu also speaks every language in the world, and is a sort of citizen of the world, a translator, if you like, in every situation, which is another interesting feature of the kind of impossible life of the black citizen of the world that you
Well, I mean, I come from the Yoruba tribe of Nigeria, and the Eshu character is like a trickster character, is actually central to the stories and the mythology of that culture.
Well, yes, I know that. But one of the properties of Eshu is also this ability to understand every language that's spoken. And I wondered if there wasn't a kind of Yoruba universal in that trickster figure that was also important beyond the particularity of that cosmology among the Yoruba. That was my point.
Yes, no, absolutely, and I think that ability for translation is a useful tool for a kind of multicultural global character, because actually you need that language as a means of surviving through the systems.
So at that point, the headless figures lose their heads but acquire the globe in place of their head.
Yes.
Would you say that's something that registers that?
Well, yes, absolutely. There's a kind of a universal, that globe is a metaphor for that striving for the non-racial, binary, because it's the kind of non-binary space.
Maybe we have an image of one of those. There we are, the discus thrower with a globe for a head.
Yes, but this work is actually quite serious. This looking into neoclassical sculpture or classical sculpture. Now, I realized that the alt-right were actually using white marble, white as a way of representing the kind of right-wing ideals, as a way to connect to a high cultural ideal. A German art critic, a German art historian, Johann Winkelmann, came up with this notion that classical sculpture was always white, and that white then representing a kind of purity of the Aryan race. But in fact, as we all know, classical sculpture was always painted. They were not white; they were painted, and so I then decided to look at that and to look at representation and who owns what culture. I mean, of course, as we know, the Romans got their, classical art from Greece, and then of course we know, Egypt before then. So we know that this ownership of this nationalist ownership of culture is a kind of fallacy, because culture itself comes from influences from many places, and so culture then belongs to us. And as we know, the nation state is a relatively modern concept anyway, and so the act of actually reclaiming those classical sculptures, the images of the Western ideal of culture, and then remaking them by putting the patterns on them, and then swapping the head. I mean, in fact, Adolf Hitler did own the discus thrower as well. So on the one hand, they may look like fun pieces, but there's a kind of a serious kind of thinking that's gone into.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's been very striking during the last year or so in London, and I think also in Berlin and New York, to realize that the art world itself has become a target for the organizing of the alt-right,
Yes.
where the precarious legions of wannabe curators and wannabe artists and so on have been seized upon as a vehicle for the expansion and development of that movement.
Yes,
I think
yes.
that, on the one hand, and the resonance of the languages of civilizationism on the other,
Yes.
often in a rather trivial mode of expression, means that revisiting these questions becomes an urgent and imperative consideration.
Yes.
I mean, even in some of the institutions that we know and love here in London, there's a great deal of ferment within the student body in the art schools around these questions, and I think it's extremely interesting that you want to engage that here in a deadly serious way. Perhaps you could talk then also. Sorry. Do you want to talk more about these, or should we talk about now the public art stuff?
We talk about public art, yeah.
Right.